Welcome to the September Microsoft 365 for Government User Group meeting. Please keep your microphones muted, but this will be an interactive conversation, so feel free to ask questions. Our guest today is Tim Hayes for the Office for eDiplomacy from the State Department. He is the Deputy Chief of the Knowledge Leadership Division, and he's coming to us today to share about their experience in deploying Microsoft Teams. I will pass it over to you, Tim.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. So, hi, everybody. Good to see you, and certainly enjoy the conversation just as we got started. Please feel free to just interject questions as we go through this. So I don't have a terribly long briefing, but I did want to just sort of lay out how we got to Teams, I say continuing journey because it's going to be a long journey the way I see it. So there's just a little bit about me as far as what I've been doing. As Jeremy said, I'm the Deputy of the Knowledge Leadership Division. We are in the Office of eDiplomacy, which is, people often ask what that is. We are in the IT Bureau, but we actually have Foreign Service generalists with us. So for those of you who might not know, the generalists are like political officers, econ officers, and the office was set up many years ago to help bring end users into IT decision making, as well as improve communication and collaboration. So we were kind of the logical place when the IT folks were looking for, well, who can help us with the user adoption, and as we roll out and communication and collaboration platform like Teams. So we became the main focal point and ran the original pilot and have been doing a lot of work on Teams really since we did that. Just a little bit on the State Department, you all probably know, but we have around 75,000 employees worldwide, and you can see that many of them are overseas, and of those 75,000, well over half are actually foreign nationals who work in our embassies and our consulates. So we're spread around the world. I mean, essentially, we have some sort of presence probably in every country. We're in the GCC environment. We're using the E3 license, just to put that out there, because obviously that sometimes puts some limitations on. The one other thing I would throw out, just sort of numbers wise here, while we have 75,000 employees, we have around 109,000 licenses. And so, we are the service provider at all the embassies. And so those additional licenses are most of them are going to be people from other agencies who have accounts on our internal network. We call our internal network OpenNet. So if I happen to say OpenNet today, that's what I'm referring to. I'd like to just kind of go through a little pathways today, starting with how we did a gradual rollout over an 8 or 9 month period. And then we ended up applying Teams to some real events, which got us bringing more people on board. And then, of course, the major event was just earlier this year when we, took this giant leap and just put a whole bunch more people on Teams essentially overnight. Then I want to run through some of the general use cases that we do, and then talk a little bit about the preparations that we did in advance, as well as adjustments we made, communication and training, as you can all imagine, which are important. And then lastly, what we see as the future challenges. So we got started in October of 2018. You all know Rima. We were very lucky because Rima was actually working as a consultant. She was with Microsoft, but was one of the Microsoft consultants that was working at the State Department for, it was at least 6 months, and it could have been longer. It was before she went to her current position in the Teams product group. But so she helped us with this, as well as several of her colleagues. But we planned on this to be a gradual rollout. We didn't want to try to, pump it up and say, make some big, wide announcement. And we ended up with about 1,000 users. And I'll talk a little bit more about this player coach model for support. But we were really concerned, and it wasn't so much us on the the user adoption side, as the support people were concerned about, getting all kinds of support requests. And so what the player coach model was designed to do was to sort of identify those people who could really act as trainers within their own work units. And so they would be the people who would work with their colleagues. So if their colleagues had questions about teams, especially the how do I questions, those kind of questions weren't supposed to go to the help desk. Only issues that should have ended up at the help desk would be something technical. And early on, we didn't have hardly any technical issues. And in the beginning, the Teams desktop application was not, it had not been FedRAMP yet. And so we were mostly in the browser for the first 4 or 5 months. And I think that the numbers worked out to be, we only had 4 or 5 help desk calls. So we found this player coach model to be very effective. The one other thing that we did is we initiated remote access from the Office 365's apps. And by that, I mean, we set up a program at the time, we called it off-prem. And it's just using Intune to allow users to get access to the O365 apps. And it was originally designed somewhat, if you could download the Microsoft mobile apps on your phone, and we allowed people to do this on their personal devices. So it was a managed application type of approach. But it also allowed people to go to any internet connected computer, log into myapps.microsoft.com using the multi-factor authentication and get to all the apps via the browser. So that was, I have to say, I don't think that was done with any sort of, real definite forethought as far as when we might need it or how we might need it. But it was, I think, more in line of, here's the capability, it might fit in. We have other remote access capabilities, but they're a little more strict and a little more stringent. Phones, for instance, people would have to have a government phone. And for the remote access, we have a VPN solution. So this kind of opened things up. But again, it was really low key, word of mouth. People would have to put in a request for it, but it wasn't something that was advertised throughout the entire department. Throughout most of 2019, it was really just word of mouth expansion, and we saw the user base expand up to around 4,000. This remote access program that I just talked about, we saw a fair amount of increase there, but mostly it was just because people wanted to get to Outlook, right? So it really wasn't doing a whole lot for us on Teams. And most of it was focused on the mobile devices. A lot of people weren't even aware that they could get to the desktop. We were able to sort of, though, keep working on the player coach model, and we found that was very successful. And then as this user base grew, we saw that we needed to do more than just, we were doing a lot of chatting in Teams, we were responding to people in Teams, but we started to see that, we needed a virtual community. So we set up this thing called Teams Learning and Support Team. And, remember back there, these were the days where, the control over channel content wasn't super. So, I mean, we could limit the number of channels that were created, but we couldn't limit the people posting and everything. And this team has really evolved to the point that now that we can moderate channels, we only have a couple of channels where we let people just ask questions. But then we have other channels that you would expect in, in this kind of environment where, we post new features, or we post recent changes, or we post learning opportunities, but we don't have people responding in those channels. We have an Ask Me Anything or a How Do I channel. Interesting. This team today has around 5,000 people in it, so it's pretty successful. Some things to be worked on, but we're pretty pleased with it. So just a little bit more on the player coach model. The one thing, this is, I think many of you might just kind of look at it and say, well, it's very similar to an advocates or a champions program, which it is. We had not designed sort of an enterprise-wide type of advocates program before Teams came, we had been looking heavily at groups because people were interested in, that kind of getting those kinds of resources together and creating groups. And we had a Department of State O365 advocates group, so that was pretty much based on email. The thing that I liked about the player coach and how it fit into teams is essentially we said to these people when they asked to join the pilot, we would say, okay, you're going to be the owner of the team. So, by just the nature of the way teams are structured, you can say, okay, if you're going to be the owner, then you're the coach. And you need to take responsibility for those people that you're going to invite into this team. And so that native structure in itself was pretty helpful, because we said, and as the coach, you need to help your players or your team members understand how to use the application. So that really worked out quite well. It put the onus on the team owners, but it also then set up this capability where we could interact with the owners. So we had the team learning and support team. Then we also did general training for basic features, and then we also had these Ask Me Anything sessions. At the time, the user base wasn't that big, so we could just do those on Teams. And that was starting to highlight Teams meetings. In the beginning, we were not too focused on meetings. It was really a whole lot more of a focus on setting up a team where people could collaborate. And so it was a place to say, let's put your files in here. Let's talk about how you can collaborate on documents and how you can communicate. So in September 2019, our CIO had a global IMO, and IMO stands for Information Management Officer. So those are our senior IT foreign service specialists at every embassy. And as I said earlier, this is a conference, on-site conference we held overseas in Budapest, and we used Teams to organize and manage the agenda. And this proved to be very effective. I mean, we learned some things there. In that we had the full agenda on Teams. It pushed people over to start to look at using the Teams mobile app. We missed sort of a couple opportunities, I think, as I look back on it. We didn't invite our CIO and the deputy CIO. They were speaking every day, and what we should have done is invited them to actually send something out from their Teams account, some sort of, or maybe mention a team or something like that. But even though we didn't do that, we did introduce it to a fair number of power users. They went back home, and we saw our user base grow to 12,000. And so that's pretty much where it was sitting as we went through the end of the year. We were starting to see a lot more activity. Still hadn't been a tremendous focus on meetings, because pretty much we're all sitting in our workplace at our desktops, and we don't have microphones and we don't have cameras. There was actually a pilot underway, and it was actually being run by our security people of all people. They wanted the capability, and you can imagine they were also, the other part of security were people saying, no, we can't do that. But so again, the focus was pretty much on collaboration and communicating via chat and channels. We had also initiated a migration off of Skype for Business, and we were seeing that as a way that we were going to drive people over to Teams. And we had already, well, here was the thing. Our planned date to auto start the Teams desktop app on our enterprise desktops was the end of March. And we were going to auto start Teams. We were going to let Teams and Skype for Business run simultaneously, and then shut down Skype for Business at the end of May. So that obviously got delayed a little bit, but that's where we were when the pandemic hit. Max Telework directed at least 80% of our workforce immediately, almost overnight, went to Teams or went to telework, and we saw this dramatic increase in remote access. And so, I mean, in some respects, maybe that's the way you do it. You just sort of throw everything at everybody. What they did is we had this Intune remote access capability, and people were having to request that. But once we got the word that we were all going to telework, they just turned that on there were some employee categories, but certainly for all U.S. employees, they turned it off for all domestic employees, and then they let the embassy people decide which of our locally employed staff could also get it. So they were able to turn on the capability, and then all we needed to do was explain to people how to get to the capability. Now, the capability is getting to myapps.microsoft.com. But of course, now think about people are getting to those capabilities on their personal devices, laptops, desktops. In almost every case, they now have cameras and mics, right? So you can imagine calls and Teams. So here are some statistics that we pulled, and just off the back end, the usage statistics that we get from from Office 365. That's the standard. It's a Power BI dashboard that Microsoft provides. So these are active users. We had 225 active users in February. You see that jump to over 14,000 in April. And again, chat messages, 2,200 some to over 21,000. And these are totals for the entire month. The one that just still kind of blows my mind is that we had a total of 277 calls in February and over 37,000, really almost 38,000 calls in April. Chat messages, you can see, went from 96,000 to close to 4.5 million. So, that I just don't know any other way that you'd see that kind of bump up other than what happened to us. And all in all, it was reasonably successful. We were getting calls, but it was on the order of maybe 3 or 4 a day of people who said, I can't access Teams. And a lot of it had to do with them not fully understanding how to get to it using, we were calling this Access Go browser. And then we have another access method called Go Virtual. That's our VPN. And so the limitation on Go browser is you can't tunnel back into all of the information that's stored on-prem. Now, we were able to work out a way, there's a proxy server where we could get back to some of that information. But so people would come in on what we call Go Virtual. Go Virtual does not have a voice and video capability, and they were trying to make calls. So that's where we're getting some of the issues. But by and large, things went reasonably smooth. And you all probably are aware that the Microsoft tracks in Teams, they track calls, chat messages, meetings, and channel messages. And we saw all of those spike in April, and then we saw them sort of just level off to like chat messages for the next couple of months is somewhere between 3.5 million to 4 million. So it's not quite as high as it was in April. The only statistic that we've seen continue to go up is meetings. And I didn't put that on this slide, but meetings last month were over like 60,000 meetings in a month. So it's clear that people have really figured out how to use meetings in particular, and they're using it quite effectively. So here's just a rundown on some of the use cases that we saw. Some we were aware of before, others popped up. And you all probably see the same thing with your organizations. If you just kind of turn this loose and let people go, they can come up with a whole bunch of great ideas. So embassy town hall events, that pretty much makes sense. The only caveat I would add to that is we had a fair number of embassies where people actually had to evacuate out of the countries. So these were not just town halls for people who were at home in their local environment. People could have been scattered all around the globe. Onboarding new employees, we've seen that one really pop up as the amount of time that we spend at home teleworking increases. We helped our HR people a couple of weeks ago. They had 50 new employees, and they were very concerned because the head of HR was going to give them a welcome address on a Teams meeting 5 minutes after the Teams meeting started. And there was a lot of concern that these 50 people might have a little bit of difficulty figuring out, how to access Teams, how to get in, make sure they're all muted, that dog's not barking in the background when the head of HR for the department is talking. It all worked out really, really well. So it showed us that people can figure out how to do this. We helped the organizers set up some basic instructions. We ran them through some basic ideas on how to organize a team. Things like just put a slide up in the beginning, 5 minutes before the team starts, have a way to have some music or something playing, so you don't have a bunch of people asking, can you hear me, and all that. And it really worked quite well. This next one was interesting because if you remember, in the first few weeks after the whole COVID crisis started, the State Department was in the process of working out repatriation. I forget the exact number, but I think it was in the tens of thousands, if not more, and how we would get these citizens back. And so our consular affairs offices around the world were, working overtime trying to figure out what's the best process, how do we do this? And they actually set up a team. We helped them set up a team, and they use that to coordinate the best practices that they then put out to say, okay, here's the best way to do all this. So it really showed a way to jump in there quickly, figure out a good way to get something done using something like Teams. The next one I think is pretty obvious for most of you, a 24/7 operations center. We have several of those. The one that really comes to mind is we have a CERT, a computer incident response team. So it's people who look at various activities on our network. And it was really one that showed the power of the player coach model, because they had a person who was really chomping at the bit to get to Teams. So as soon as we turned on Teams, he set it up. He was the coach for this entire center, and it worked very well. And we still reach out to him today. For instance, like when shifts came, we reached back out to these power users and said, okay, shifts is coming. Would you like to pilot that? And that's worked very effectively. These last two, diplomatic discussions, connecting our counterparts, host nation governments, and then also the U.S. government interagency. I'll speak to those a little bit later, because, more or less in the beginning, Teams was internal. Obviously, there are ways that you can, invite in other agencies, other people, and so we made some adjustments, especially once we got into the to the COVID environment, to where we enabled some of that. Here are some other use cases for us. Our transfer season is just it is sort of hectic from May until September. Foreign service officers turnover every 2 to 3 years. And the communication between the incoming and outgoing officers, that has perennially been one of our biggest knowledge management issues. There's guidance in our regulation that says, the outgoing officer is supposed to write a memo and leave all the information for the outgoing officer. That hardly ever gets done. Many times the outgoing officer tries to copy over a bunch of emails, and they throw them in a folder somewhere for the incoming officer. And that often is not very effective. So what we started to do was to look and say, well, Teams makes a whole lot of sense, given the persistent nature of all of the conversations going on in the Teams, given the fact that all you have to do is give the incoming officer membership of the team, and then once the outgoing officer is gone, just take them off the team. You don't have to do that through any admin process. We started to see that that's paying a lot of benefits. Document clearances, that one, some of our offices and parts of our organization are becoming very familiar with it. This is probably our biggest change management user adoption challenge, because people love their email. And so they want to just be able to attach copies of those documents and send them around and then have multiple copies. So we've taken the approach to try to first just say, get the document in a team, share the link from the team, and at least, even if they share the link in email, at least they're taking advantage of being able to manage permissions, and then we'll start working with them to try to bring that all together. We're definitely seeing panels and committees. I mean, it's not unlike we were talking about with Microsoft and its Ignite, everything going virtual. A lot of different parts of the organization are looking at how they can set this up and do that. The asynchronous communications, I think, is an interesting one. We have the program is probably an acronym. I would assume that's unique to the State Department. It's DETO, DETO. So what it stands for is domestically employed teleworking overseas. So essentially what that means is we have people who are assigned to my office, but they are actually living overseas. And this has become kind of a family friendly policy for the State Department, because we find that we have foreign service officers who are married. So we have couples, and the more senior they get, the more difficult it gets for them to find jobs simultaneously at a single post. So this allows a foreign service officer, one, to go to the post and be employed at the post, the second one to go to the post with their spouse, but essentially telework and work for us. So I had one person working for me just when we started Teams, and he was in Kazakhstan. And it was pretty amazing to see how much our collaboration and our ability to communicate improved once we went on a team. I was actually using like OneNote before Teams got deployed, and we were typing notes into OneNote, and that was kind of working. But as soon as we got Teams going, it just really improved everything dramatically. So in the past year, I had another person working in Trinidad and Tobago, and I have a person on the West Coast, and then we also now have a person in Denmark. And it's in my office. This person doesn't work for me, but our office also has a person in Conakry, and I think it's West Africa. But these people have really been truly integrated into the office, and I feel like they're as integrated as if they were sitting outside, if we were sitting in cubes next to one another. And we've gotten, I think, very adept at how we take advantage of the Teams features, the thumbs up, different ways to chat and communicate in and out of channels, to where I would say it's one of the strongest benefits we've seen. And then the last one would be the knowledge sharing. And again, I would refer back to this Teams learning and support team we have, where there are, like I said, close to 5,000 people on it. We had the listserv platform. In fact, I think it's still functioning, but we've seen a lot of the listservs move over. And so there are several other teams of communities like that. One is like the sysadmins from around the world. And I think that team has in the neighborhood of 2,000. We've set up a team just for feedback on the O365 apps. So that team has a channel for forms. It has a channel for Planner, has a channel for Power Automate. And if the channels get big enough, we could potentially peel them off and make them into teams. but it's been very helpful in using Teams to, and especially in the case of the Teams learning and support team, using Teams actually to support teams, right? And people are pretty tolerant. We see people who don't fully understand all the capabilities of Teams, and sometimes we get similar questions, but it's an ongoing process, and we understand that. But it's a super way for people to feel comfortable to ask their questions, and for their colleagues to help them. And I think what we're seeing is a bit of a paradigm shift to where the first place people are going to look to go when they're looking for support is they're going to go look and see if they can find a team where they can post a question, as opposed to many before would just send a ticket off to the help desk. And those kind of tickets to our help desk, the help desk is really focused on technology and not so much on how do I do something. So I mentioned preparations and adjustments. So a lot of this popped up as we started to go to the COVID environment, if you will. And I'm going to talk about communications and training in a couple other slides, but let me just jump to the third bullet and look at some of these other things. So one of the first things that we did, and this is only maybe a month into COVID, and so maybe late March, early April, we allowed cameras and mics on the desktops in the workplace. Now, obviously, there's certain areas, CAAs, things like that, where they're not going to be allowed. But other than that, there was just blanket approval, and we had several cameras, several headsets that had gone through our change control, so they were authorized. Because I was surprised at how quickly people realized that as folks are at home, they put on a headset, they start to make calls, they do essentially what we're doing today. They're going to want to do that when they get back. And so how do we get that whole process started, as well as we want to make sure they're included, because what happens if you're the one person that's in the office and the 6 other people on your team are at home and they're communicating via Teams, but you don't have any way really to access it. The next thing that we had actually been talking about before COVID happened was limited guest access. So we had been talking about guest access to where a team owner could invite people in, essentially to be full-up members with the restrictions really, I mean, the owner can set them, as you all probably know. So we did that, but it was limited to the fact that the guest had to have a .gov or a .mil email address. And we set up a separate team because I was really concerned that we set up a team essentially just so that people who had invited guests could communicate with one another, because we quickly found out, for instance, that most of the guests from GCC High could not access our teams in GCC, and it was a policy set by their agency. So we had no control over that. So we set up this team once again to initiate communication amongst our team owners who had guests, so that they could learn, what worked and what didn't work, because there really wasn't any way for us to know that in advance. And we still struggle through, and it'd be interesting to hear as maybe in a discussion period. I had a case where someone was inviting people from DOD to a meeting, and they were clicking on the join the meeting in their Outlook, and the Outlook was taking them into their Teams application, still logged in, and it wouldn't allow them to connect. And so what I asked them to test was to take the link to join the Teams meeting and to paste that into a browser. And that way it allowed these people to join from DOD in the browser, because it wasn't connected into their, it wasn't credentialed into their, what I assume was a GCC high environment. So it's those kind of things, trying to figure that out. And that really leads to the third bullet, which was we had turned on external participation in meetings. And this got a little confusing for some of our people, but we allowed the capability for anybody to invite people from outside the department to meetings. And there's no limit on that. So any email address at all will work. And again, sometimes there's some issues as far as the people trying to come into the meeting, and normally it's dependent on whether or not they have, not so much whether they have the Teams desktop app installed and running, but whether or not they're logged into some other instance that might prohibit them from joining other meetings. But this has worked pretty well to have people come in. The last thing we did was, and Microsoft actually, pushed us a little bit on this one. Primarily, there's an audio conferencing license add-on, and in our case, I don't know all the various different options you have, sort of with if you want to bring in phone capability. But what this one does is just automatically adds a conference call-in number to any invite that you send. And it also had local dial-in numbers for about 40 countries. And as the organizer of the meeting, if you have this conference add-on, this audio conferencing add-on, I can invite people once the meeting starts by typing in their phone number, and it'll dial in their phone. So essentially what it does is give people a way to get into a meeting with voice without having access to, say, the Teams app. As I said, Microsoft offered that gratis to us for a while. We're now we're not going to buy the add-on license for everyone in the department. We have a process set up for people to request it. It turns out the cost is about $5 per person per month. So another reason that this became important is our the conference calling cards we had, the phone cards, those all started falling apart right after COVID as well. And by that I mean, people were dialing in and the numbers were busy, or they were dialing in and being brought into other meetings. So there were all kinds of other things that were going on. Okay, I just got the note that I'm being signed out. Can you all still see this?
Yes.
All right. Are you seeing the note saying you're going to be signed out?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I can't move that.
Can you click continue?
Yeah, how about I'll just continue, and if there's any words that you can't see, just ping me, and there's only a couple of slides left, and once we're done, I can refresh. This is something that happens as frequently. I'd be happy to hear your experience on that. Anyway, on the communications plan, I think this is reasonably straightforward for all of you. We had formal communications, and we call those a department notice. The department notice pretty much is. It pretty much focuses domestically. The cables are, transmitted worldwide, and then the bureaus also would have their own bulletins. But I think in some cases the informal communications were just as effective. And that's the virtual communities that I've talked about, various offices with their announcements, and then people still using distro lists. So we're pretty heavily dependent yet on some of the email functions. But I think the big thing to remember there, and we're seeing this more and more, is just, you cannot communicate enough. And you think people, will have gotten the word, and, they just haven't. And that was particularly important. I mentioned to you that we were going to do our Skype for Business migration. As it turns out, we delayed that by a couple of months, but we in fact did go through with the plan. And so we auto-started Teams on the OpenNet desktop a couple of months ago, And last Tuesday, we shut down Skype for Business. And so when I say shut down, it's still available to some people for some particular reasons. But in most cases, we have moved everybody over to the Teams only mode. And we had been in the island mode before, if you're familiar with that, as far as Skype for Business. But we did find that, as a week before we're going to shut Skype down, we're still finding people that say, well, I didn't hear that. And even though it had gone out in all these different communications. So it's really important. And we see the same thing, with new features as well. So on the training plan, let me throw out a couple of things that what happened on training. Because we were all geared up to do some on-site training and some virtual training because of the Skype for Business migration. Essentially, we were going to focus that training on the Skype for Business features of Teams, if you will. So primarily chat, but also screen sharing and screen control. But we found is some people like it online, other people like it in person. And of course, many people just want to see video, right? But then we have those people who want written guides. So we prepared all that. We had worked with Microsoft through their eSIF program and had a third party who was going to help us with that. And we were very fortunate because we had set up a flexible training program. So we were able to convert what was going to be some on-site training and some virtual training into all virtual. So we had from about midway through April to the end of May, so for about a 6-week period, we had twice a day virtual sessions. We were able to have some of those at 7 in the morning, some at 8 at night, so that we could get people from around the world. And overall, we had more than 15,000 people attend training sessions. So we found that to be very successful. The other thing is working with your organization's trainers. I'll talk about this a little bit in one more slide, but we have a very large training organization. Some of you might be familiar with the Foreign Service Institute. It's out there in Arlington on Arlington Boulevard, but it's a huge campus. But it is a huge training organization, and getting them to adjust to the rapid pace of change that's going on in software as a service like Teams has been a bit of a challenge. So, how do we keep them from saying, oh, it's going to take us 6 months, we need to do a needs assessment, and then we're going to put together a bunch of PowerPoint briefings, and then we'll have some training set up for Teams. Meanwhile, Teams has changed, 30 times significantly across that 6-month period, and all of the the images and everything they're getting ready to teach have already changed. But we did find is that these training sessions in particular were quite useful for the point and click training, showing somebody, if I go to Teams and I click on this icon, then this is what's going to happen. But the other thing that we have found as well is that we've set up sessions to train the work unit as a whole. And we were doing this a little bit on site before COVID, but we now just do it virtually, but it's really the last part of the change management and the user adoption. How do we work with people to say, okay, clicking on that button does something for you, but then how do you weave that into how you are going to collaborate and work more effectively inside of your office? And we found that to be very effective. It's time consuming. But especially to get people started on it, I think it's almost essential. And it also gives you a lot of feedback into, here's what people learned when they did the point and click training. Here's what they still need to figure out in order to use a platform like Teams to work more effectively. And so, yeah, these new Teams features, the one thing I'd say is they come so rapidly. They also sometimes come without any advance warning. And so that's something that we're really working hard on. So last slide here, future challenges. To maintain the momentum, I'm really concerned that people will go back into their workplace and kind of fall back into their old habits. And in particular, I'm worried about them going back to, because they don't have a mic capability in particular, that they don't use Teams to effectively meet and collaborate with people. But more importantly, I'm concerned that they start to just attach copies of documents that they need to collaborate with people on to emails. And so we're looking really hard at how do we continue to keep this momentum going forward and to not lose. We're looking at what kind of policies we can continue to change. The biggest thing has been the microphones and the cameras. The audio conferencing is also one. Like I said, we're doing it on a person by person basis, and I think we had over 5,000 requests. But as some of you can imagine, if you're in some sort of a classified area, they're not going to get a camera probably or a mic. So maybe a dial-in capability is something that you would need so these people could still continue to join the Teams meetings. And then, just the bottom line I mentioned earlier, just trying to keep up with the rapid pace of all these new 365 features. We talked a little bit that we were chatting about that with some of you in the beginning of the meeting. How we know they're coming, what do you do? And we are constantly answering questions from users who say, I saw this on the internet that says it's coming. And the more sophisticated ones are even looking and trying to figure out if it's in GCC or not in GCC. There's a lot of communicating that needs to go on there so that you can let people know what is happening. And there's also a lot of communicating I'm finding that needs to go on with Microsoft to learn what they think is happening, and then we can all come together and see what the true picture is. So the bottom line is it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a big effort. But in the long run, we're seeing a lot of improvement, a lot of really super capabilities that are getting rolled out. And I think the other thing is if you can turn the user base free, they'll come up with a whole bunch of ideas that we probably haven't had yet. They're very creative, and once again, it's another area where you want to keep the communication channels really open so you can hear from them. So when they have these really good ideas, you can share them widely throughout the organization so that everybody can take advantage of them. And with that, that's my last slide, so I can stop here with questions. Anybody have any thoughts, questions?
No, that was really great to sort of walk through how you guys managed a nice, good timing on the decision to slow roll it a year before COVID.
Right. Well, having been in the Air Force, the favorite saying, I'd rather be lucky than good, right?
Yes.
So.
Any questions? Well, fantastic presentation today, Tim. We really appreciate it. It helped us all as we do our rollouts to hear the experience of, especially an agency as large as yours, which is, got a lot of complexities. So we really thank you for coming and joining us today.
Okay, well, thank you. I enjoyed it. And please, if you've got any specific questions, let me know.
How old is the eDemocracy office?
eDiplomacy. eDiplomacy was set up under Cole and Powell. So actually 2003 to 2004 timeframe. So we're right around 15 years, give or take. And it's kind of interesting because we've held pretty true to the mandate. I've been in eDiplomacy for 9.5 years. So the mandates that I mentioned to improve communication and collaboration, bring the end user into the ID decision making, and the last of the 3 mandates was to implement or develop and implement a knowledge management strategy. So we run, for instance, an enterprise wiki. We are the business owner for enterprise search, and we still have a large communities at state program, and that's based on WordPress, and we've got over 100 communities, and some of that was done early on. You could probably set some of these communities up now, like I said, using Teams or other platforms, but we started most of this back in 2007, 2008. Office didn't have a lot of a big budget either, so that's why we went the open source route. So the enterprise wiki is based on MediaWiki, and the communities at state is based on WordPress.
The tech is, whatever tech he uses is secondary to the whole idea. I just love the whole idea of the office, that
Right.
IT and end users come together to sort of figure out what to do. And because that's the biggest problem I'm running into is I'm not in the IT department, and my IT department is solely thinks of itself as a procurement agency. Here, we bought you this tech, go.
Right.
And
Right.
no thought of users whatsoever.
Right. And that's it's still somewhat problematic for us as well, because we're not a big office. And I would look at something like, say, Teams, right, or Office 365 in general. So let's say you're pushing that out to the entire enterprise. Who is the responsible office for doing the user adoption or the change management? And as I look around the State Department, and much like you said, Joe, there's nobody, right? And so some organizations will say, well, that's all training. There is a training component to it, but you also have to have somebody who's going to continue to push. And it's not just knowing how the platform functions, it's how you can use it to work more effectively.
Yeah, that's another issue with my organization sometimes. You said 6 months for a need assess. I used to be a training guy before I became a SharePoint guy. And my organization's training arm requires 18 months from you tell us, we'll do a needs assessment, we'll develop, and then we'll deliver.
Right.
18 months.
Right. And so that's just not going to work for any of this stuff. I mean, it's just,
yeah.
So, I mean, the other thing that I think that I'm hoping we learn from the whole COVID experience is, all of our training has had to go virtual, and the Foreign Service Institute is really, its solid foundation is teaching foreign languages. But how much of this could actually go virtual rather than having to have people in place? And especially as you look at some of this more tech training, and we often bring people in from around the world. So if we could avoid doing that and only bring them in when we want them, we need them to be face to face, or for maybe longer courses. But for some of these things, having effective, online virtual training, I think is probably the way that we're going to go in the future.
All right. Anybody else? Any other question or comment? Well, thank you again, Tim. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy. I enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody.